There is a building in Armenia that should not exist, not from bad engineering or impossible architecture, but because of everything that has tried to erase it over 1700 years. Persians, Arabs, Mongols, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and then the Soviet Union, which didn't try to demolish it outright, but did something in some ways more calculated. They tried to turn it into a museum, to reclassify it as a cultural artifact, something people walk through quietly behind a velvet rope instead of something they actually believe in. It didn't work. The building is still there, still the seat of the head of the Armenian Apostolic Church, still standing on the exact coordinates where, in 301 AD, a man who had just been pulled out of a pit said God told him to build. It is called Etchmiadzin, and most people who have heard of it don't know what the word actually means. In Armenian, it breaks down like this: Etchnal, the descent, me, only, Zin, begotten. The descent of the only begotten. That is not a poetic name someone gave a building after the fact. That is a description of what Gregory the Illuminator said happened before a single stone was laid. After Gregory healed King Tiridate, he had a vision. In it, he saw Christ descend from heaven to that spot, strike the ground with a golden hammer, and mark the place. That is where the cathedral went. Not near the spot, not in the general vicinity, on it, exactly. The altar inside Etchmiadzin sits over the spot where Gregory said the hammer struck, and that altar has been there in some form since then. The name Etchmiadzin wasn't formally adopted until the 15th century. Before that, it was called the Cathedral of Akhashapat, but the meaning was always the same. This is the place where the only begotten came down. Every destruction, every empire that tried to erase this building ran up against that claim. Not just the cathedral, the site of a divine address. And for 1700 years, Armenians have treated it accordingly. Here is something that tends to get mentioned quickly and moved past. Etchmiadzin was not built on empty ground. When Gregory began construction, there was already something on that site, a pagan fire temple. Archaeologists excavating under the main altar in the 1950s found a granite stele dating back to the 8th or 6th century BC, and beneath it the remnants of a fire pit, a place where, centuries before Christianity, people had come to worship. Gregory built the cathedral directly on top of it. That is a theological statement as much as an architectural one. This connects to what we talked about in the last video. Gregory's very first act after Tiridates converted was not to build Etchmiadzin. It was to go to the places where Hypsime, Gayane, and the other women had been killed and build chapels over their graves. In those churches, St. Hypsime's and St. Gayane's still stand, and today are part of the same UNESCO World Heritage Site as Etchmiadzin. The seat of the Armenian Apostolic Church sits within walking distance of the graves of the women whose deaths made it possible. That is not a coincidence. The women are the foundation, literally and in every other sense. Here's the thing about a building that has existed for 1700 years. It's been destroyed and rebuilt so many times that what you see today is not what Gregory built. Not even close. The original structure was likely a wooden basilica. It was damaged during Persian invasions in the 4th century and rebuilt by Nerses the Great. Damaged again, rebuilt again in 483 AD by a man named Vahan Mamikonian, who redesigned it as a cruciform church with a central dome, the architectural form that would go on to influence Byzantine church design across the Christian world. The dome you see today dates to the 17th century. The frescoes inside were painted in the 18th century by an Armenian painter named Nagash Hovnatan and later restored by his grandson. The bell tower was added in the 17th century. Parts of the exterior stone are from different centuries entirely. Every king and Catholicus who oversaw a renovation got their names on the record. The workers who built it, the stone cutters, the laborers, the people who climbed scaffolding and laid foundations and carved the details that made it beautiful, are almost entirely anonymous. We know the commissioners, we do not know the hands. That is how most of history works. The powerful get named, the people who actually built things are invisible. 1,700 years of anonymous labor. People who believed enough in what the building meant to spend their lives maintaining it, none of whom we will ever know. In the 5th century, the Persian Sassanid Empire, which controlled Armenia at the time, attempted to impose Zoroastrianism on the Armenians. They didn't just suggest it. They built a Zoroastrian fire temple inside Etchmiadzin. The pyre from that fire temple was unearthed under the altar during the 1950s excavations. The Armenians resisted. They fought at the Battle of Avarayr in 451 AD, outnumbered, under a general named Vartan Mamikonian, against a Persian force trying to force them to renounce Christianity. They lost the battle. Vartan was killed. More than 1,000 of his soldiers died. But here's the thing. They did not convert. And within 30 years, the Persians, realizing that no military force was going to make Armenians abandon their faith, formally agreed to let them practice Christianity freely. The cathedral survived. Then came the Arabs, then the Seljuk Turks, then the Mongols. Each time the cathedral was damaged. Each time it was rebuilt. The name Etchmiadzin, the descent of the only begotten, was first written down by a 13th century historian in the middle of the Mongol period, as if someone felt it important to put the name in writing precisely when everything around it was being destroyed. By 1604, Shah Abbas I of Persia made a decision. He wanted to move the Catholicate, the seat of the Armenian Church, to Persia. And when he couldn't do that, he did the next worst thing. He had 15 stones removed from key structural points in the cathedral, including the stone marking the spot where Christ was said to have descended, and transported them to Persia to build a new cathedral there, in the likeness of the original, so that Armenians displaced to Persia would have something that looked like home. He understood that the building was the memory, that if you could relocate the memory, you could relocate the people's sense of where they belonged. It didn't work either. Etchmiadzin was repaired. The Catholicate stayed. And then came the Soviets. When the Soviet Union absorbed Armenia in 1920, the church came under immediate pressure. The seminary was shut down. Church properties were confiscated. Religious life was suppressed across Soviet Armenia in ways that were systematic and deliberate. In August 1938, at the height of Stalin's purges, Soviet Armenian authorities formally resolved to close Etchmiadzin entirely, convert it into a museum, and never elect a new Catholicus. The plan was to let the institution die quietly by cutting off its leadership and reclassifying its holiest site as a historical exhibit. But then something unusual happened. The Soviet Armenian leader, a man named Grigory Arutanov, addressed the matter to Stalin directly. He argued that Etchmiadzin was not just a local matter, that it had international weight, that the Armenian diaspora around the world looked to it, that closing it would have consequences beyond Soviet borders. Stalin contacted him within a month, asking whether he still insisted on closing the Catholicate. Arutanov said he did not, and that was that. Stalin kept Etchmiadzin open, not out of faith nor respect, but because he saw it as a strategic tool. The Armenian diaspora, Armenians who had suffered the genocide and scattered across the world, still looked to Etchmiadzin as their spiritual center. The Soviets could use that connection as a line of influence into diaspora communities abroad. So the cathedral continued to function, reduced to a skeleton staff, isolated, barely alive, but open. It was reportedly the only church in Soviet Armenia still open under the communist government, while every other Armenian church around it was being turned into warehouses, military bases, museums, or simply demolished. Etchmiadzin kept its doors open because even an atheist empire understood that some things carry more power than the state can simply decide to erase. The cathedral underwent a major restoration starting in 2012, funded not by any government, but by Armenians around the world. The diaspora, the descendants of people who survived genocide and occupation and Soviet oppression, sent money back to rebuild the building their ancestors had built and rebuilt for 1700 years. It was reconsecrated in 2024. Etchmiadzin is still the seat of the Catholicus of all Armenians, still the mother church of the Armenian Apostolic denomination, still standing on the exact spot where Gregory said God marked the ground in 301 AD. I started this video by saying it's a building that should not exist. What I mean by this is that by every reasonable calculation of what history does to things, it should have been erased. But it wasn't. And the only explanation that accounts for all of it is that the people who kept rebuilding it believed that what it stood for was worth more than what it would cost them. That is a remarkable thing to sustain across that much time, that much suffering, and that many empires. There is something else that happened in that same city, Vakashapat, about 100 years after Etchmiadzin was built. Something just as important to the survival of Armenian identity as the cathedral itself. Armenia had a church. Armenia had a faith. But there was a problem that Gregory and Tiridates had not fully solved. The Bible, the text at the center of everything, was not available in Armenian. It existed in Greek and in Syriac, languages most ordinary Armenians couldn't read, which meant that for 100 years after Armenia became the first Christian nation in the world, the majority of Armenians were Christian in name, in practice, in identity, but could not read the words of the faith they were dying to protect. And then a monk named Mesrop Mashtots decided to do something about that. He didn't just translate the Bible, he invented an entire alphabet to do it. That's the next video, next Sunday. Subscribe so you're there when it drops. Alright, peace.